Good afternoon and welcome to the kickoff of the 2024 fall season of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series and our third season in total. Wow, what a turnout. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is John Carlton and I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series and the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this lecture series. Today is our 10th lecture in 10 months, and that's with taking November last year and January this year off. So we've really been busy, and thank you all so much for turning out. We wouldn't be able to do it without your participation, attendance, and support, and the fantastic presenters, and of course the Paul Sawyer Public Library. And a big thanks to the library for hosting us, and to my co-organizer Diane Mahoney for everything she and her staff do, both for the lectures and the community. And many thanks to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for taping the lectures and hosting them on their YouTube channel, and to the State Journal for always giving us great additional publicity. I want to remind everybody that you can find flyers with the full season printed in the back, and you can find the schedule on the library's website as well as frankfortheritageweek.com. Next month's lecture will feature one of our favorite local people, Kentucky Historical Society's Director of Research and Publications, Stuart Sanders, who will be presenting on his recent book, Anatomy of a Duel: Secession, Civil War, and the Evolution of Kentucky Violence. He will discuss the origins of dueling culture, the impact of the Burr-Hamilton duel, all the way up to post-Civil War. And there are some prominent Frankfort names in his book. I also want to remind you that we have scheduled another pop-up lecture on August 27th at 6 p.m. on Kentucky's paleontology and fossil record, entitled Kentucky Fossils, presented by Daniel J. Phelps, founder and president of the Kentucky Paleontological Society. And just so you know, we are already booked with presenters every month through next summer, and we are adding pop-up lectures between all the time. So be sure to keep up with us if you enjoy learning about Frankfort, Franklin County, and Kentucky history. As we learned in June with Chris Hall's lecture on an archaeological perspective on human history, archaeology is a subgenre of anthropology, and anthropology is the scientific study of humanity concerned with human behavior, human biology, cultures, societies, and linguistics in both the present and the past, including archaic humans. So archaeology is a scientific endeavor, not just a study of history. For that reason, some of the more than 50 federal laws about historic preservation protect archaeological information from public disclosure. This began in 1906 when Congress passed the American Antiquities Act to prevent the looting of Native American sites. And as both Chris Hall and Tressa Brown explained, most of the information we know about the past indigenous peoples come from archaeology. That can create an unfortunate gap in public knowledge. If the sites and studies are protected, how can the public learn what archaeology and anthropology have to say about Native peoples? Enter public archaeology. And our speaker today is at the forefront of that field. She is also widely considered one of the state's best equipped archaeologists to teach us what archaeology knows about Native peoples in Kentucky and Franklin County. Native history in Kentucky spans over 11,000 years, encompassing a rich and complex narrative of diverse cultures and events. As we've heard, the state's American Indian history is primarily recorded in its archaeological record, with thousands of sites, including camps, villages, caves, and mounds. According to the Office of State Archaeology, only less than 3% of Franklin County has been surveyed by archaeologists. Within that 3%, there are over 200 archaeological sites, 160 of which have Native American components. From these sources, a history emerges that reflects the cultural, religious, and ethnic diversity of Kentucky's indigenous peoples, chronicling their challenges, triumphs, and losses, and highlighting their endurance. Largely due in part to the work and research of our esteemed presenter today, her husband, Dr. David Pollock, and many of their colleagues across the state. Since the 1980s, there has been a resurgence of interest in Kentucky's Native American heritage. Various initiatives have aimed to increase public awareness and appreciation of this history. Intertribal powwows, archaeological demonstrations, and educational programs have highlighted the contributions and experiences of Kentucky's Native peoples. Institutions like the Salado Wildlife Education Center and the Kentucky Historical Society at the Thomas D. Clark Center for Kentucky History both here in Frankfort, have established exhibits to showcase ancient Native American history. And organizations like the Kentucky Office of State Archaeology, the Kentucky Archaeological Survey, and the Kentucky Native American Heritage Commission at the Kentucky Heritage Council, also here in Frankfort, are to be commended for their tireless efforts at researching, building, correcting, and updating the historical record so that we may more accurately know and understand our state's past and the rich history of its people. Efforts like last month's lecture by Tressa Brown to combat stereotypes and the dark and bloody ground myth have also gained traction, fostering a more nuanced understanding of the state's indigenous past. These activities have fostered a growing visibility and acknowledgement of Native American contributions to Kentucky's cultural fabric, and we are excited to help contribute to that effort in this lecture series today. So without further ado, please welcome Diane Dehoney, Community Service Librarian with Paul Sawyer Public Library, to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you so much, John. As he said, my name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Community Service Librarian here at Paul Sawyer. On behalf of everyone here at the library, we just want to thank you for coming out this afternoon and spending part of your weekend with us. I think our crowd just continues to grow for these lectures, and it's wonderful to see. So give yourselves a round of applause. It's wonderful to see folks excited about our history. So thank you for being here. It is my great honor to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Gwynn Henderson, a native of southern Delaware, has been interested in old things, dinosaurs, and in being an archaeologist since she was young. She received her BA in 1975 in Anthropology from the University of Delaware and her MA in 1982 and a Ph.D. in 1998 in Anthropology from the University of Kentucky. She is the Education Director for the Kentucky Archaeological Survey, a program of Western Kentucky University's Department of Folk Studies in Anthropology. An archaeologist who researches ancient Native people, Gwynn has carried out field research in Kentucky, the Ohio Valley, Tennessee, and Mexico. She is interested in researching the lifeways of indigenous farming cultures of the Ohio Valley and the history of mid-18th century Native groups in that region. She has written, presented, and published many professional reports and papers describing the results of her research, and with David Pollock, directed the University of Kentucky undergraduate field school in archaeology for 4 years. With David Pollock, she received the Ida Lee Willis Memorial Award in 2014 for lifetime achievement in research, education, and preservation. She is also a member of the Kentucky Native American Heritage Commission. As an archaeology educator and public archaeologist, she works with archaeologists, teachers, and museum educators to develop content, lessons, booklets, video programs, radio spots, exhibits, and workshops that make information about Kentucky's rich archaeological heritage accessible to a wide audience. She and her colleagues have researched the effectiveness of Kentucky public archaeology programs, published on how archaeology can best be used to help school children learn about the past. In 2023, she received the Society for American Archaeology's Distinguished Achievement in Public Archaeology Award. She is a member of the Living Archaeology Weekend Steering Committee and serves as a facilitator for Project Archaeology, the Kentucky Master Naturalist Program, and Primetime Family Reading. Please help me to welcome to the podium today, Dr. Gwynn Henderson.
Marvelous introduction. He laid it out so marvelously. Today I'm going to talk about what we know about Native American history in Franklin County from Franklin County Archaeology. And I guess it depends. Do people usually ask questions during the presentation, Diane and John, or do we wait? At the end. Okay, at the end. I also want to bring to your attention that there are free posters on the back table that illustrate the length and diversity of Kentucky's Native American history. There's also some colorized ones, but those cost money because they cost more money to print out. And you're welcome to take the free ones and take a look at them and discuss them and so forth. Those of you who have already taken the posters, if you want to follow along with me as I go through it, that's fine too. Okay. I also, somebody took my notes. Don't be taking my notes. I want to be sure that I got the facts here for people. Many years ago, in 1992, I supervised the excavation at a site here in Franklin County, but that was 92. I mean, that's a long time ago. So I went to that woman's presentation and paper to find out what the heck she found out at that site. It's a pretty cool site, I got to tell you. Okay, so I should be ready now. Thank you, John. I would have looked down and gone, wow. Okay, shall we begin? We shall begin. Okay. Native history, multiple sources about Native history. And I'm not here to provide you information from all of those sources, but just particular sources. But I wanted to remind you that Native history is contained in the stories and songs and perspectives, oral histories that Native peoples tell us and their own children. Native history is also told through life experiences in the past and now. Native history is also told in Kentucky's places, all over Kentucky. The evidence of indigenous people having lived here in Kentucky is just everywhere. Eastern Kentucky rock shelters, burial mounds, in caves, on high places and floodplains, everywhere. And that's not to be surprised because thousands and thousands of years of history are recorded on the Kentucky landscape. The objects on those landscapes are the particular source that archaeologists can interpret for you and for indigenous peoples as well. Diverse objects made out of all kinds of natural resources that are here in Kentucky, that Native peoples avail themselves of to live their lives. And what I'm going to be providing you today is interpretation based on archaeological research at sites, in addition to information from anthropological research on peoples who are tribal or who live in our hunters and gatherers, any kind of information that anthropologists have learned from studying living peoples. Those are marvelous analogs for helping us interpret the patterns of artifacts at the sites where people lived long ago. But first, I want to be sure that I mention the myths, which Tressa, if those of you who came to hear Tressa's presentation, have already heard. But it bears repeating again. The most persistent one is that Native peoples never lived in Kentucky permanently, but only hunted here. When I was a young archaeologist coming to work in Kentucky in the late 1970s, I thought, well, my time in Kentucky will be short if they never lived here permanently. Alternatively, the concept of them looking at their watch and saying, well, it's 11:30, we can't live here permanently, we're going to have to get across the Ohio River, seemed absurd to me too. This is not a true fact. And my presentation, complementing Tressa's presentation last month, will provide you information to show you that this is not true. Native history is Kentucky history. And as Kentuckians, whether we are of Native descent or not, it's also our history. The earliest chapters of Kentucky history are Native history. Native peoples lived here for a long time. They still live here, and they lived here permanently, even in Franklin County. But there's other myths, like there are Welsh Indians that ran around in Kentucky. That a lost race of ancient mound builders, because everyone knows native peoples couldn't have been building those marvelous mounds. It should have been somebody really amazing. We all know that native peoples aren't amazing, so somebody else must have built those mounds. Not true, but that's what people sometimes think. There were never any ancient giants. Maybe a very tall person. I'm not going to say there weren't tall people, but giants, no. Other myths that sort of connect with these others that I just mentioned is the myth that Kentucky was a virgin forest, a virgin place. Native peoples lived here but never impacted the landscape. As human beings, by definition, is to impact the landscape. Now, the impact that native peoples had on the landscape isn't nearly as overt as the kind of impact we have on the landscape today. But if you consider native peoples living in Kentucky from 9,500 BC up until Euro-Americans arrived in the 1700s, that's a lot of years and a lot of impact. But don't take my word for it. Scientific data from archaeological sites and biological sites in Kentucky have documented how native peoples' use of fire on the land impacted environments, creating microenvironments in Kentucky. When the Europeans arrived in person in the 1700s, it was not a virgin landscape. It was a place where humans had manipulated it as hunter-gatherers, as gardeners, as farmers for a long time. No virgin landscape. And then, this is a new one for me, as I've done more work with school kids and teachers. There's been this implication or unexpressed feeling that because Native American technologies appear simple, they're not computers, they're not electric, they're not as fancy as ours, that they're simple technologies, and therefore simple-minded people use those simple technologies. I would challenge any of you to come to Living Archaeology Weekend in September and successfully throw a spear with a spear thrower. I've tried it a couple of times and I've just given up because I don't know what it is. The trajectory, the physics of it, I don't get it. Native peoples knew their resources. They knew what they needed. They used technology to make a life for themselves, just like we use technology to make lives for ourselves. And so, while it may seem simple to us, when you begin to think about all the information that you must have to be able to successfully build a house, create ceramics, weave textiles, chip stone tools, you realize that it's not simple at all. And these were really smart, like regular people, doing their thing in their home, just like we do today. All right. When I asked John how far he wanted me to go in Native American history today, he said, stop before Europeans come. Let's not talk about the Europeans. We've got all kinds of presentations about what Europeans are doing. Stick with Native history. I said, okay. So here's the timeline that I'm going to be using for my presentation. This is the first and main. This is Native American history before Europeans, 9,500 BC. I stop it at AD 1539 because that's when the DeSoto Entrada happened in the eastern United States. I'm also going to sort of jump in just a little bit into the eve of written history, 1539 to 1730. The rest, native peoples are here, but they're not the major players. And John wanted me to talk about native history as them being the major players, and so that's what I'm doing. Okie dokie. The very first folks. Kentucky was not like Kentucky today back then. As you can see, I'll use the pointer here. Okay, see here we are right there. See the edge of that glacier? Okay, so that means this is all more like Canada. So Kentucky a long time ago was a cooler place. The plant regime was more like Canada. And while some of the animals were much like the ones that we see today, there were some really big ones. They're called megafauna, and we've got those various guys. Have you guys been listening to the news? They just sequenced the DNA or something of the mammoth, which is like, okay, the concept of a woolly mammoth walking around is kind of wacky. Anyway, there they are. The woolly mammoth and the mastodon and the Clovis spear point is the exemplary artifact that indicates someone lived here during this ancient time. It's not that these megafauna were the only animals. There were smaller animals and so forth. But, and folks who focus their studies on these ancient folks feel that we focus too much on these large megafauna, that a friend of mine said, if somebody had brought down a mastodon, they wouldn't have stopped talking about it for the rest of their life, because it wasn't that common, in his opinion. These animals are very tall, and you need to work together with people using your spear and spear alone. There's no spear thrower yet. It's just your knowledge working together as a group and strong arms that can pick off the weaker or younger mastodons or mammoths and bring them down. And use every bit of their body for food and clothing, shelter, and so forth. This is a family butchering one of those really large caribou. These hunting and gathering peoples, the very first ones to come to Kentucky. Can you imagine coming here and not, I mean, I think of myself when I go into new Krogers. I mean, I know a Kroger, I've been to a Kroger. But you know, you go into a new Kroger and you just can't find the stuff that you're used to. It's not in the place where your Kroger has it. It's frustrating. You have to map onto that new Kroger in order to get the foods you need. These people are coming into a land where no humans have been before. They're the first. They are Kentucky's true pioneers. Everybody else are colonists, settlers, whatever you want to call them. But these are pioneers, the first. And they've come into this amazing place, this rich place of Kentucky. Small groups with their dogs. These would be the many generations later of the folks who crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into North America. Did any Paleo-Indian people live in Franklin County? I'm glad you asked. Paleo-Indian sites have been found in the bluegrass, but none have been for sure recorded in Franklin County. Notice I say recorded in Franklin County. Somebody on a farm in Franklin County may have found a Clovis point or other diagnostic stone tools made by Paleo-Indian peoples. But if it hasn't been recorded, I can't share that information with you. So I have to tell you, I've got to believe they did come to Franklin County, particularly since one of the theories is that these earliest people followed the main rivers into the interior. And we've got the Kentucky River here So they could have followed the Kentucky River into Franklin County and lived here for a while. But so long ago and so very few people, it's difficult to find evidence for the people, the very first people. Okay, now I'm going to move to the later hunter-gatherers. These are the descendants of the folks who were here first. And if you take a look and do the math, this is 7,000 years. Longest chapter in Kentucky history is this time period. Okie dokie. These folks have lived here. They're not the first. They know their Kroger. So they have mapped onto the landscape. They know where the resources are. They know when, in which season the resources occur. And they move across the landscape through the year, annually, an annual round, they call it, identifying places where to live for the resources that they use. There's two different ways to do this. You can either, and in this case, I've got the one where you have this riverside camp and you go back and forth to various places, okay? You can stay in one place and go to all places, or you can move from place to place to place to place to place. It's the same kind of thing, exploiting the local animals, plants, riverine resources, and so forth. At this time, Kentucky's climate is more like the climate of today, and throughout the rest of this time period, it is like the environment today. Deciduous trees, same animals that we think of, deer, bear, elk, raccoons, all those kinds of animals, and the trees, the shrubs, and that kind of thing. These hunting and gathering folks, we see a campsite here. There's multiple different kinds of campsites, as you can see here in this generalized. You've got a nut collecting camp. You can have a stone quarry where you go and collect chipped stone resources. Because Kentucky is underlain by limestone and chert or flint occurs naturally in limestone, it is a perfect source. It's like a Kmart for your stone tools. Just roll out of bed, go down to the creek, if it's rolled along the creek, or go to an outcrop of limestone and you can find chert. Some of the chert's in good shape, some of it's really fine, others is not so good. Native peoples knew what to do to improve the stone for knapping if it's not in such good shape. Notice I've got wild berry collecting. So you've got multiple camps. Not surprising given this way of settlement and so forth. Sites of these people are everywhere. You can't walk a plowed field without finding some evidence of these hunters and gatherers, because they lived all over the place, they moved all over the place, and they lived here for a very long time. Archaic sites, or these hunting and gathering sites in Franklin County, not surprising, are extensive. The very earliest ones from the 8,000s and 6,000s are here. The ones from the middle part, the ones from the late part in the 1000 BCs, they were all here. Many of them show that people have been there back and again and again and again and again across millennia. Good place to live. High point, near water, near chert resources. These people knew their land, knew their homeland like the back of their hand. And so they would live in places, go back over and over and over again. Two sites are particularly significant here in Franklin County because they really show the long history of these hunters and gatherers throughout this entire time period. There is also, interestingly, a shell mound site here in Franklin County. Do I have a picture of that? No. Okay, here, I'll get to that. Hang on. Okay, these are the animals that these folks exploited. How do I know? Because archaeological investigations at these hunter and gatherer sites preserved bones and preserved plant remains show that these kinds of animals were exploited by these folks. We find deer bones, we find the seeds of blackberry, for example, and nutshell. This is the technology that they used for hunting. This is an improvement over using a spear, because a spear thrower, as you can see in the upper portion of the slide, extends the length of the human arm, amplifies the strength of the person's arm, and improves the accuracy of the thrown spear. Please note, these are not arrowheads. None of these are arrowheads. People call them arrowheads. They're not arrowheads. You don't use an arrow with an atlatl. Well, that's a lie. The Aztec people used arrowheads with their atlatls. In fact, the word atlatl is a Nahuatl term for spear thrower. So you can amaze and impress your friends by saying that you know an Aztec word. But the native peoples in Kentucky used spear points with their atlatls. When they began to make arrows is when they began to use bows and arrows, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. Okay, so you can see the different sizes and styles, just like cars, just like hairstyles, just like eyeglasses kinds of things, and just all kinds of things in modern life. They changed their style. If I was talking to you in the 1950s, I would not be wearing pants. I mean, we just don't do that. But this is the 21st century, and I get to wear pants, and I'm very pleased with that. And so the styles of these tools are the clue that archaeologists use to determine how old or how long ago an archaeological site was lived at by ancient people, or I should say, a camp was lived at by ancient people. You can see the different colors of the stone as well, indicating different types of sources of stone that the native peoples used in making their weapons. Shell mounds tend to be in the Green River area in western Kentucky, Muhlenberg and Ohio counties. There is a shell mound here in Franklin County, and it's very unique, being that it's in Franklin County. Has anyone investigated it? No, they have not. I can tell you there's a shell mound here, and that's as far as I can get. But I will say that these shell mounds are a link to the various ways that indigenous peoples used their homelands. The shells, the riffles and shallows in the Kentucky River would have been the place for shoals of freshwater mussels. And that source of food would have been used by indigenous people. Now, friends of mine who studied these animals and have eaten them suggest that perhaps it was not, it wasn't a particularly tasty snack. And so they think that mussel shells may have been more of a starvation food, or something that they ate not because they were really yummy, but because it was something that they had available to them. Here are some examples of technology that are linked specifically to these hunters and gatherers in Kentucky. Okay, so, what's up with this marine shell ornament? Last time we looked, the last time there was a shallow marine sea in Franklin County was millions and millions of years ago. And you would be right. These marine shell ornaments are trade items. And very early in this time, this 8,000 to 1,000 BC time of Kentucky history, we see that native peoples were trading with other people in other places in North America for items that they didn't have that they wanted. And they wanted marine shell. These are examples of marine shell. You can almost imagine the conch shell that went along with this. Some people will say, well, you know, those people who lived long ago, I don't know, they didn't really have any art, right? They were living by the sweat of their brow and they only were barely surviving and all of that. Well, here's an example of an engraved bone pin. Can you see the engravings here? I think to be human is to make art. Whether that art preserves for archaeologists to find is a different story altogether. Yes, these people so long ago were involved in decorating things, making art, expressing themselves or their culture in these ways. Bone fishhooks, bell-shaped pestle. A number of bell-shaped pestles have been recovered from these hunter-gatherer sites in Franklin County. Let me make sure I've got them all covered here. And that's, oh, okay, got that. Yep, okay. Yes?
The picture top left there, would that be the Civilian Conservation Corps, better known as CCC, under Franklin Roosevelt?
No, this is WPA, Works Progress Administration, under Franklin Roosevelt.
Okay. Who's the administrator?
WPA?
Oh, okay, WPA.
Yeah, WPA,
okay.
Roosevelt, that's right. Make work projects were scattered all across Kentucky during the Depression. Out in Muhlenberg, Ohio, and Ohio counties, in Greenup County, in Boone County, in Montgomery County, and in Marshall County. Places where the Depression hit particularly hard in Kentucky. And what is marvelous for us to understand ancient indigenous American history is that that work was done. More examples of trade goods here. We think some of these kinds of items may have been traded for the marine shell. This is barite. It's a kind of mineral that's found in central Kentucky, and this particular one has been shaped, sort of loaf-shaped with two holes here, perhaps some kind of an ornament. This item here is also locally made. It's a plummet made from hematite. Banded slate, copper. During this time, copper, which is not local to Kentucky either, was traded during this period. So even what we would consider to be really early, very early in Kentucky's native history, there are connections between native peoples living here and native peoples living in other places. This kind of thing is called down-the-line exchange. You can stay put in your home, at your camp in Franklin County. You can trade to somebody, who then trades to somebody, who then trades to somebody who's living, many trades, on the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic Coast. And they will trade back, and you will get stuff from far away. Indigenous trade is more of a relationship building, an economic relationship building kind of experience. And so trading partners in some cases were passed down. So my dad's trading partner, his son would be my trading partner then. Okay. And here's just a general overview of what hunter-gatherer life might have been like. We've got nets here, the importance of the dog, always with the dog, eating the sandals, right? Dogs eat our shoes today. I guess they're eating sandals then too. Baskets, which are preserved in only particular environments, like in rock shelters or caves. Turtles, deer. You can see that the folks are wearing fabrics. These fabrics are made from textiles from native plants, canoes, just sort of a scene reminding us of the people behind the objects that archaeologists study and try to interpret. Okay, we'll move to the hunter-gatherer gardeners, 1000 BC to 1000 AD. This is a time to remember mounds and pottery and gardening. If you guys leave with nothing else remembered today from my presentation, please remember that Native peoples domesticated native plants in Kentucky, turning themselves into gardeners and changing their way of life. Okay, there are 6 world hearths of plant domestication, which you can see on this map, and Kentucky is the one in red. If you are a scientist who studies how humans domesticate plants, you know all about the archaeological sites in Kentucky. This is where corn is domesticated, for example, and beans. We've got corn here and peppers. These are peanuts. This is rice. Here we have oats, wheats, and barley. We think of this, we don't think of all the rest of them. Here, in our neck of the woods, Native peoples used fire, digging sticks, and their native plant knowledge that had been collected over generations of living in this environment to domesticate these plants. And how can I tell you that they domesticated the plants? Because the charred or burned remains of these seeds are preserved in some archaeological sites. And a friend of mine, well, many friends of mine, who are wearing increasingly thicker eyeglasses, archaeobotanists, are looking at these charred plant remains under a microscope. And they see how erect knotweed that is domesticated, goosefoot that's domesticated, native squash seeds, marsh elder, and sunflower, those seeds look different physically from wild examples. Now, the other seeds, the other plants on this slide, they haven't seen the change in morphology, but they occur routinely as part of the suite of plants, which they refer to as the Eastern Agricultural Complex, in these same hunter-gatherer gardener locations, their sites. Some archaeologists are experimenting with how these were grown and the challenges and affordances of that. Some archaeologists are studying the nutritional value of these plants, and they feel that the overall health of these hunter-gatherer gardeners was significantly better than the farmers who were their descendants. Better nutrition from these plants and the animals that they hunted. The plants, the wild plants didn't go away. They used wild plants too. And here's an example of fabric from plant fibers from a rock shelter site in eastern Kentucky. So it's wild plants that they domesticated along with exploiting wild plants that became part of their foodways, their subsistence practices, same animals. I don't know how many of you all are gardeners yourself, but if you've got a garden, or if you're a farmer, you are tied to the land in a way a hunter and gatherer is not. And from a certain perspective, the domestication of those plants sort of domesticates a person too, or a culture, or a group, because they have to stay in one place and tend to those plants. Native peoples knew about these plants long before they began to domesticate them, but over time, they saved the seeds, planted the seeds, the plants became domesticated, they continued to plant them using fire, a digging stick, and their knowledge of plants. A big change happens towards the end of this time of hunter-gatherer gardeners. Folks switch over from the atlatl spear thrower to the bow and arrow. And you can see how these are two very different weapon systems. These are true arrowheads right here, little triangles. These are spear points. I told you gardening was one thing to remember. Another important thing that happens during this period is the beginning of the manufacture of pottery. I don't want you to think that they didn't have containers before. They had wooden vessels, they had carved stone vessels, they had baskets and nets and things like that. But at this time, they begin to make pottery using locally available clays to form their initial vessels. Actually look a lot like their carved stone vessels. And here you see the progression in eastern and central Kentucky from the earliest ones all the way up to the most recent ones. So this is 1000 BC, and this is what you expect to see around 1000 AD. As a person who specializes in the analysis of native peoples' ancient ceramics, I've got to tell you, this stuff is pretty ugly. Only a mother could love it. Although I will say, this one's pretty cool. It's difficult to show this in a slide, but the reason why it's got these little dimples here is because they've gone through and pinched it with their fingernail. They've made these like little digs in a pattern, right? The other thing that's important about this early pottery is flat-bottomed vessels and really, really thick walls. This is not to be confused with this. Not much difference. Well, there is much difference in terms of vessel shape, as you can see here, but the beauty factor is still not particularly high. And here you see some examples of the rims of vessels like this. You've got a little notching here. These vessels are, the walls of these vessels are particularly thin, not thick like the earlier ones. And here's sort of an overview of what a hunting and gathering and gardening village might look like long ago. So, are there any of these kinds of sites in Franklin County? Well, let's see. Okay. All right, so yes, there are campsites, there are mounds, there's a rock shelter, and larger camps, perhaps villages, here in Franklin County. One of the mounds in Franklin County is clearly an Adena mound, and I want to thank John for bringing that information to my attention. It had copper there in it. It was a burial mound. A couple of people were buried there. There was, what else? Some shell items were found there. The individuals had been cremated. This is a signature of the Adena culture. The Adena people lived in central Kentucky. This would be kind of outside of the range of Adena, but clearly from the remains that were there, is likely an Adena mound. And Adena people lived in Kentucky, I don't know, around 200 BC, 400 BC to about the time of Christ. Huge burial mounds in Montgomery County and Boone County, accretional mounds. The mound in Franklin County was a much smaller one. In fact, here's an example of a burial mound. The WPA were going to work on this mound, and what they're doing here is skimming back the trees so that they can begin to excavate it. These mounds and earthworks are Not, well, a couple of, like I said, there is a mound that has been documented for Franklin County, but not so many these earthworks or sacred circles, which is an example here. It's a perfectly round mound or earthwork dug into the ground along the Elkhorn Creek, North Elkhorn Creek. And here is an illustration of stone pictures, petroglyphs, stone picture, pecked into the sandstone. In eastern Kentucky, particularly in the Red River Gorge, there's a large number, quite a density of these stone carvings, these pecked stone carvings, animal feet, looks like deer tracks that they've pecked into the ground, or turkey tracks, or geometric designs, or something like that. This is a petroglyph of a turtle. These kinds of things archaeologists find difficult to date, but because of their association with certain kinds of things in the rock shelters and nearby, the working hypothesis is that these were more frequently made during this time of the hunter-gatherer gardeners than in other time periods.
Could we go back to the burial mounds, please? I know we have some in southern Ohio and southern Indiana. Are either one of those two photographs in Kentucky?
Yeah, they're all in Kentucky.
Where are they?
This one is in Montgomery County. This is the Wright Mound in Montgomery County, north of Mount Sterling. And this is the Mount Horeb Earthworks that's owned by the University of Kentucky along North Elkhorn.
One's near Mount Sterling?
Yes, but it's not there anymore because it was excavated completely.
Okay,
So you can't see it. There is, however, if you want to see an Adena mound that has not been excavated, go to Mount Sterling and turn onto the bypass. It would be the Mount Sterling. No, there's two Mount Sterling exits. You want to take the one closest to Lexington, so that would be the first one going east. And if you take the bypass, there's a mound there. It's called the Gateskill Mound, and it is an Adena mound. But it's not conical like this one. This one is more loaf-shaped at Mount Sterling. This is a Kentucky village, circular village, houses, people doing their thing around 700 AD. In Kentucky. You can see examples of all different kinds of technologies going on here. You've got somebody using a paddle wrapped with cordage to make pots, the ever-present dog. We've got the bow and arrow here. A woman is standing making textiles. You need to know that these folks didn't use looms when they made their textiles. This is finger weaving. And examples of these circular houses with some kind of a stockade or a palisade around them with mats covering the circular houses. Okay, now we'll move into the hunter-gatherer farmers. Can you see how the time periods are getting a little shorter and shorter and shorter? I think it's because archaeologists have a better control of time. 1000 to 1539. Two different farming groups live in Kentucky at this time, the Mississippians and the Fort Ancient people. And it's the Fort Ancient people that are Franklin County. So you can see the way it's laid out here, and here we are in Fort Ancient land. These people are farmers. They grow corn, beans, and squash, sometimes a little goosefoot and sunflower, but not nearly as much. They sort of when they turn to farming, they sort of turn their backs on the Eastern agricultural complex of native plants and turn to these non-local plants, corn and beans. But they keep the squash, the local squash. This is called swidden agriculture, or slash and burn. And this is where the fire really becomes important in clearing large areas for their fields. Fire is the tool. Here's the process. You start with the forest or an open spot that's a savanna that has some trees. You cut the trees down and burn the brush off. If the trees are too big, you girdle them so that they will die and stand there. Then you put your crops in. After a while, your crop production goes down. You put it into fallow. You let it lay fallow for a certain amount of time until you put it back into production again. Circular process there of farming, very sustainable. Agriculture scientists study the sustainability of this particular approach to farming, and they are suggesting that this is a kind of farming we might want to consider these days. How it works is there's this sort of symbiotic relationship between the corn and the beans and the squash. The corn is a nitrogen taker, the beans are a nitrogen fixer. The beans grow up the corn plants, the squash grows along the bottom of along the ground, shading it, and it's just really marvelous. It's interplanted, so only corn in a cornfield is not what you would see if you came to a farming, a field from a native farming village at this time. These are the tools that they used for farming, the ever-present digging stick and their knowledge of the plants. But in addition, they used freshwater mussel shell hose or elk shoulder blade hose to work the fields. Here's what they grew. So it's a sort of a replace some, keep some, same animals. In fact, the native peoples who lived here the farming peoples who lived here, the Fort Ancient people in Franklin County, it's almost boring after a while. Corn, beans, squash, yeah. Deer, bear, elk, turkey, yeah. And yet, not boring at all. Okay, so in Franklin County, we've got options here for different kinds of village layouts. Very interesting. I will say, before I go any further, I don't want to forget one of the earliest Fort Ancient sites. Where's my notes? Really important one, has given us much perspective on the beginnings of farming in central Kentucky, frankly. And this site in Franklin County is a small site. It's a short-term occupation, and the radiocarbon dates from the site date it to just as corn agriculture is beginning. And what's cool about it is that fragments of corn and gourd were found at the site. But what's really cool is it is an example of pottery that is made only in a very small region of central Kentucky. This pottery is different from the stuff in Jessamine County. It's different from the stuff in Mason County. It's just in Woodford, Scott, Franklin, and Fayette counties, along the North Elkhorn only. What is up with that? Looking at the pottery, for me, it looks like it's fallen in from, I don't know where the heck's come from. It is wacky pottery. But that's the kind of pottery. And so to me, what this says is, in this early time, this significant time of moving from gardening to farming, very small areas, very localized conversations, very localized interactions are going on. It gives you a sense of this sort of heartbeat kind of thing, close interactions, expanding outward, close, expanding outwards for the connections. And in this case, and the site in Franklin County shows us, very localized interaction at this time when this incredible change is going on. From 1200 to 1400, there are circular villages. And there are circular villages here in Franklin County. This is an artist's reproduction of what one might have looked like. And I don't know if you can even see the burial mound. I think you have to stand on one foot and hop. See it? Can you see it? Tiny little burial mound. Just a short period of time during this particular history are there burial mounds that date to this time period. And so what you can see is that the Fort Ancient in Franklin County is a part of a much bigger cultural expression in this area, and this is where we are. Circular village. And the excavations at this site in Franklin County really helped us understand settlement, village layout, and so forth. After 1400, but yet still in this time period of the farmers, the villages are no longer circular, but they're more scatters of houses, of relations in a much bigger site. So the sites are larger, but they're not organized in circles. You can see that the area of where Fort Ancient people live has shrunk. So there's a kind of group pulling back in, maybe the same number of people in the region, but larger villages. So there's a kind of grouping together of people. In addition to the villages that they live in, they're also living in hunting camps, and we have ethnographic description of this kind of settlement, of villages and hunting camps in the historic times too. And these hunting camps can be small camps along the river, they can be small camps in rock shelters, and I believe that examples of rock shelters, yes, villages and rock shelter camps, and also smaller camps like on high ridge tops are here in Franklin County. So the entire expression of Fort Ancient settlement is here in Franklin County. Here are some of the tools of daily life that you would expect to see at a village or a campsite in, well, from 1000 to 1400. See, the pottery is going to look different than the stuff later on. Arrowheads, some that are serrated. There are some shell ornaments, these particular ones called marginella, are marine shells, and these are likely made from marine shells too, but not quite as much exchange or trade as we saw during the hunter-gatherer or the hunter-gatherer-gardener time period. After AD 1400, you can see how the pottery style has changed. And so it's the style of the points and the style of the pottery that, along with the radiocarbon dating and so forth, it gives us the sense of how long ago they lived at a particular site. I've always thought this is a particularly sweet artifact. This is a smoking pipe. Kind of looks like a deer head to me, but I'm not sure. Okay. There are two sites here in Franklin County that really illustrate how Fort Ancient people lived on the landscape and their farming approach to life. Because their villages they would live in for, 20 to 30 years, maybe 50 years max. And then they would move within their homeland to another place because their fields weren't producing like they should. And then they might move back to a place. So in their minds, they had these places, the old place that they might come back to time and time again. In this case, in Franklin County, we have that evidence. This particular site here, Fort Ancient people lived there. Well, hunter-gatherers also lived there too, so it was a good place to live. So the Fort Ancient people lived here, and then about 50 years later, folks moved in again. they came back to the same place. It's the way these native peoples, as farmers, moved around their landscape. All right. And this Western Village Plan, when we did excavations at this site, then this is very not common for the entire site to be revealed to archaeologists. Usually we just excavate in a little place here and 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 make inferences about what went on. In this case, the entire site, the plow zone, was removed completely from this site because our research question was, can we tell the way this village was arranged? Because we didn't know that before when we did this research. And what you can see here is, okay, we knew in other places they were circular villages. Is this one a circular village that just like never got finished and people left? Or did they mean for it to be arc-shaped or what? I don't know. But it was really awesome to be able to have an opportunity to see the entire village. Well, let's put it this way. The entire village that wasn't destroyed by plowing and that was dug into the soil below. Because there was all kinds of stuff I'm sure that we missed, but it was all in the plow zone, so what could we do with it, right? Okay.
Is this scale miles or meters?
Meters. All right. So I want to focus in on this one because it's so seriously cool. 2 different kinds of houses. Who knew? Okay, now some of them, there was 8 houses at this site. Some of them were dug into the ground as a house basin. And when I say house basin, I mean a basin. I guess you would have stepped down into it. Others didn't have a house basin, and they were just a stain with a ring of where the posts were. And this is where the stain was, and then we found the posts. This one, please notice, hearth in the center, hearth in the center. This one was pretty cool and kind of head scratching. You do a lot of head scratching in archaeology, I'll be quite honest with you. So there's wall trenches on this side and this side of the house, which is something that happens around 1400 or after. And then this one doesn't have. What's up with that? Not exactly sure. Well, why is this one not in a basin? Not sure. Well, how come we don't have wall trenches? Not sure. But these are usually the bigger ones at this site. And the smaller ones are these. Okay. And here's archaeology in process. This is Will Daly and me trying to figure out what on earth is going on along here. This is it excavated, finished, so no, we know what's going on here. This was a wall trench, but we didn't expect a wall trench, and so if you don't expect it, you're like, what are we doing? So you have to be very careful, and then you see it's a wall trench, and then you don't believe it's a wall trench. Then you say, okay, it must be a wall trench, and then it is a wall trench, and then you find another wall trench in the house, and then you think, well, maybe there's 4 wall trenches on each wall, and then you look and no, you don't. You only have 2, and you think, are these native peoples messing with us? If they knew, if they only knew. Okay. Will is standing in a marvelous trash pit that's right next to this wall trench. And here's Bill Sharp using long ago technology. This probably belongs in the Smithsonian. This is a transit. This is not what people use to measure things, map things today. Now, the only time that I've ever been involved in the excavation of a house where the floor was still there was this house. It was so cool. The areas where the house floor were still present were mainly around the hearth. And then I imagined the lady of the house seated or squatting next to the hearth, stirring food in her pot, over and over and over again, and packing that soil down so hard with her feet and her children's feet and her husband's feet and her father's feet and her grandchildren's feet, that floor was preserved after all these years, because the site was built sometime around the early 1400s. I mean, you just can't get much closer to long ago people than that. It was just really quite amazing. And the materials that were recovered from that house, we know that they used hickory and white oak to form their, let me see if I have a better picture. Yeah, okay, here. They used hickory and white oak for their posts. We found these fire hearths just red like a brick, and inside some of the fire hearths we found hickory and white oak as well. These red dots here are earth ovens, very interesting. Deep circular pits. The bottom layer was burned limestone. The top layer was completely burned wood, mainly hickory and white oak. And then after it was no longer used as an earth oven, they had thrown trash in it. And so these earth ovens were particularly instructive for giving us information about their pottery, their foodways, and their stone tools as well. Okay, now here's the wacky thing. Okay, so if we're thinking it's a circular village, but just never finished, what's wacky about this one, and we think it's because of when it was built and used in the early 1400s, which is an important time change in Fort Ancient culture in terms of how they're going to organize their villages. Okay. You can organize a Fort Ancient village in 3 ways. Well, actually, there's probably a million ways, but these are the ones we've documented. Okay. You can have the plaza in the center with the food storage and then residential and mortuary refuse like that. This is a site in eastern Kentucky. You can have the refuse and disposal on the outside, residential, mortuary, and a mound in the center. This is a site in Harrison County. Or you can have it organized like this. This is a site outside of Dayton. How was our site organized? Well, it sort of wasn't. What are we supposed to make of this? Well, enter anthropology. The Fort Ancient people are not the only people who live in circular villages. There's people who live in circular villages everywhere, all over the world, all over time. This is a standard way that pre-industrialized groups lived in circular villages. I mean, this is nothing weird. It's just, but okay, so what's going on here? Well, in some circular villages, particularly the ones that anthropologists have studied and written a lot about, the circular villages in Brazil, the folks organize themselves. Their village is organized in 2 halves. 2 halves. They're called moieties. Don't remember that. 2 halves. Okay? So these folks are one group of clans and so forth, 1 half. And this is another group. Now, why did I do that? Well, when I started looking at the patterns, and it's all about patterns for archaeology, we've got 2 houses side by side on this side of the village. And the houses here are single. Most of the houses here are not in house basins. Most of the houses here are in house basins. Well, then you might say to me, well, Gwynn, this is foolish. Of course, it's different time periods. What are you talking about? Well, no, actually, we compared the pottery on both sides, and it's the same. In fact, the pottery and the arrowheads don't show much difference at all. This was a very short occupation, we think. Maybe only 50 years or 10 years? Hang on. Maybe only, 10 years. How do we know this? From the radiocarbon dates. We don't have any overlapping trash pits or houses. We don't have lots of buildup of trash anywhere else. Okay. So maybe what we have here, if this is supposed to be a arc-shaped village, and this is what you get. This is all there was. There wasn't any intention of, filling this area in here or filling this area in here. But it was these two halves of villages arranging themselves in ways. This is the old-fashioned way, and this is a newer way, and maybe this is an illustration of the changing of the patterns of Fort Ancient villages. We don't know for sure. Please note that there's an earth oven on this side and an earth oven on this side. It's a fascinating site. We estimate that there were about anywhere between 30 and 70 people who lived here. And you might ask me, well, did you get in some kind of time machine, Gwynn, and go back and count them, do a head count? No, I did not. Again, I went to Anthropology, ethnographic information, and there are anthropologists who study the size of houses and the number of people who live in those houses. Using that information and then doing the math, I came up with an estimate of between 30 and 70 people who lived there. Okay. This time period is a short time period. It's still native history. Europeans haven't arrived in person yet, but the indirect impact of Europeans is beginning to be felt by indigenous people living here in Kentucky. Still Fort Ancient people. This is the village layout for this after AD 1400. You've seen this picture before. So this is what we have after 1500. After 1600, Native people's villages look like this. They have hunting camps. And you can see the size of the area of Fort Ancient has gotten smaller. Same foodways, same technology, but at these sites, at these villages, archaeologists will find the tantalizing evidence of the presence of Europeans in North America. Glass beads, copper that has been rolled into beads and bracelets, copper snakes. Even though this is a 1796 drawing of a Shawnee guy, you can see how he has a combination of Native American and European materials. He's wearing moccasins, which is native. He's still using bow and arrow, but he's wearing cloth and using silver earrings. And then come the 1690s. Years ago, when I gave this presentation, I would explain to people about virgin soil pandemics. And everybody kind of looked at me with vacant eyes. Impossible to imagine what had happened during a virgin soil pandemic. It is not impossible for us to imagine that now, because we have lived through a virgin soil pandemic. It's called COVID. And so we know what happened to people before there was shots to take, inoculations. These folks didn't have inoculations against smallpox. The first appearance of smallpox in this part of the world is estimated around the 1690s. And between the demographers, people who study human populations and their change over time, estimate that Native peoples were impacted such that between 50–75% of people were dead. Youngest and oldest were impacted most severely. When I think of it from a more human or historical or anthropological perspective, the future and the past are deeply impacted by that first smallpox pandemic. They responded the best way they could. Certain groups lost so many people that they were no longer an extant culture. They grouped together and made their way. Everybody in this time period, in this area, were farmers, so they all knew the same kind of hunting and farming experiences and so forth. It may have been that their language was different. It may have been that their religion was different, but they knew how to make a living and grouped together and created new peoples. This is why when people ask me, well, who were the people who lived in Kentucky in 1000 BC or 6000 BC? I have to say to them, I don't know, because the pandemic took out so many people. The only groups that we know are the ones who made it through that pandemic and into the historic record, like Shawnee, like Cherokee, Tutelo, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Miami, Peoria, Potawatomi, Sara, Ofo, Occaneechi. But how many others were there that we'll never know because they disappeared? We don't. But it's not a sad story. I mean, it is a sad story, but it's not a sad story because Native history, Kentucky's Native history, Franklin County's Native history, is a history of human adaptability, resilience, diversity, creativity. It's enduring. We are the recipients of these people's ancient ways of life. We live where they lived. We walk the ground they walked on. And knowing about their history, appreciating who they were and what they did, gives us a broader and deeper perspective on what it is to be human. Thanks very much. Yes, 15 minutes is fine for questions. If anyone's got any questions, yes, if anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them if I can now, if I can. Okay, yes.
I was curious as to what you would find in a trash pit, what they would have trashed rather and why they would have used a pit rather than just sort of tossing things out in the woods or whatever to sort of return to nature.
They did. They did both. They did both. Oh, that's right. Repeat the question. Thank you. Thank you. I knew I'd forget. Okay. She wants to know, what do you find in the trash pits, and how come they did just trash pits, and how come they didn't just throw stuff out in the woods? They did both. They did both. The trash pits are easy to see and excavate because they're in one place in the ground deep. But the standard trash thrown around in the woods next to the house, that also happened too. The kinds of things that they threw away in their trash was, well, the kinds of things you might expect. Food waste, broken pots, the waste from the manufacture of stone tools, because we'll see the attempts, and you can tell people who study stone tool manufacture, which is not me, but they can look at a stone tool that's unfinished and go, yeah, I know why the guy threw it out, because it's got a flaw right here. And they've tried, and they've tried, and they've tried, and they've tried, and they've tried to thin it, and it won't thin, and they, in disgust, threw it out. And so that kind of thing. I believe that there would have been all kinds of perishable stuff thrown away in their trash too. But in this humid environment that we now call Kentucky, which was probably humid back then too, since the environment was very similar, it's only in those special places, those unique places, those places where perishables will preserve, do we find things like wooden bowls, fragments of fabric, cordage, unburned nuts and seeds and things like that. At the sites in Franklin County, in these open sites on a ridgetop along the floodplain, those kinds of perishables perish, and it's not but in the caves and rock shelters that we find that. And I guess the best analog I can consider is, if we don't put our trash in plastic bags, I should preface it by that, and if we just threw out the stuff from our house, imagine in 10, 15, or 20 years, what would still be present? Okay, the plastic would be there. The paper would not. Even, okay, we recycle, yes, we give that away, but there's still some paper that's not recycled. That paper would have disappeared. Other perishable things would have disappeared, although I know that in some trash places, the Twinkies still exist after 20 years, as do the hot dogs, which makes one wonder about what we eat. But there would have been fabric, okay, like cotton fabric probably would. I don't know this for a fact, but if anybody here is a fabric specialist, let me know. I'm going to assume that our plastic fabric clothing, right, made out of bottles and stuff, because it's plastic, it's not going to deteriorate. But any of our clothing that's made from wool or linen or cotton, that kind of stuff will, I think, eventually deteriorate over time. So that's what I have to say about that. Thank you. Yeah.
Gwynn, is there any indication in the archaeological record, any way we can tell something about whether or not these people engaged in warfare?
I'm not trying to be a smart aleck here. I don't think you can talk about humans of any time or place without saying warfare. I don't think it makes them special or unique or different. I think it makes them human. I think that to be human is to be creative, music, dance, art. I think to be human is to be economic, get the best trade you can, put it up on eBay and get your best value. To be human is to be political, to have different thoughts, different ideas about how things need to be organized, and really take the other people to task when you think their ideas are wrong. And I think warfare is a part of what makes us human. Do I think they were more warlike than we are today? No, I do not. I think it's comparable. Yes?
Here in Franklin County, I found 2 points 30 yards from each other. One is dated 4,000 years ago. The other is dated 7,000 years ago. Any comments about the disparity in the age and proximity?
A really great place to live. You know, the 7,000 years ago peeps came and went, wow, this is really great. It's up on the ridge, it's near a creek, it's near a spring, soil's good, there's great nut trees over there. Come on, let's hang out. Great. 4,000 BC, 4,000 years ago. Hey, this is a great place to live. We've got a ridge here, we've got a spring here, the creek. You know, great resources. We've got Nut trees here? I mean, come on, let's live here. This is why when when I go out and talk to folks, they say, well, you know, that's where a battle, you know, different people, this is battle. The different stone tool shapes and styles indicate that one tribe was fighting another. No, or here's another alternative explanation. People making these kinds of tools lived there, thought it was great. People later came there, made tools, thought it was great. I mean, it's the same kind of thing as we're living where they lived. Why are we here? What's up with that? Well, good place to live, river's right here, we got all kinds of resources, cool, let's live here. I mean, I think that's, I don't find it a disparity at all. I see it as a measure of what a good place it was for those people to live. And they both agreed that it was. And so there's their stuff. Yeah.
If you have burials, do you know anything about the causes of death?
Native people's health was such that to be an old person was to be, I don't know, 40s or 50s. There were infections. There were broken arms and legs. Really bad dental stuff for the farmers. That corn, which I was going to say sweet corn, but it's not sweet corn, but it is have the kind of, you know, impact on your teeth. I mean, talk about decay. Whew, man. Which is interesting because the farming peoples had really bad dental health in terms of decay of their teeth and loss of teeth. But the people who are the hunter-gatherers, because they have so much grit, so much more grit in their diet, their teeth end up being worn down a lot, so they don't have as much tooth to get, you know, decay in. So they're a lot smoother, or they're worn down. But some of the diseases, as you know, are only the diseases of our muscles or our blood vessels or our organs, our soft organs. So the kinds of diseases that we can infer that indigenous people experienced can only be seen if they leave a trace on your bones. Arthritis, for example. Yes, some people really, I mean, just horrible arthritis. So it's a narrow window of knowing what kinds of diseases that they experienced, because it can only be told if it leaves a mark, some kind of evidence on the bones.
Well, this would relate to the question about warfare. Do you see signs of injury?
Yes, we do see signs of injury, yes. We do. Yes?
In your burial sites, do you see any evidence of belief in life after death?
Yes. Because they are buried with care, with objects in an organized fashion. There is evidence, particularly in Fort Ancient contexts, that Native peoples had something referred to as ritual feasting, which links to experiences that are described in anthropological literature, ethnographic literature, where they built fires next to the grave, had ceremonies next to the grave, treated people with care. There are examples from hunter-gatherer cemeteries where people's bones have been set, that someone has taken care of the person, so that while their leg might be significantly shortened because of a sort of a bad healing, still it is healed. So yes, I think there's absolutely no question that there is belief in an afterlife. There's multiple kinds of burial treatments in graves, in mounds, carefully taken care of. So perhaps when I go through the various anthropological elements of what makes us human, I should have said belief in an afterlife and respect for the dead. I should have said that, and thank you very much for asking that question so that I could attend to that mistake. Yes?
Did you ever figure out what the significance of the trenches were in those homes?
Well, what we decided was these folks were on the cusp of deciding that they were going to be, these were the movers and shakers. And they said, look, we know the cool thing is to have wall trenches, but we're not exactly sure if we want to go all in. So we're going to have 2 of them be wall trenches and 2 of them be not. And when I say wall trench, I have to remind myself, so that I can remind you, that the construction of a wall trench wall is not the same as the construction of a wall without a wall trench, which sounds like it ought to, but let me explain it to you. Okay, so if you're going to build a house and you're going to use poles, separate poles, no wall trench, you're going to dig a hole and you're going to put that post in. And then a hole, post, hole, post, hole, post, hole, post, hole, post, hole, post. Okay. All around. And then you'll put up your lattice work that you'll throw your skins or your bark or whatever and make the house. Okay, cool. For a wall trench, different story. You dig the trench, you build the wall, set the wall in the trench. Wall trench. Now, do I think that the walls are better one way or the other? No, I don't think so. But then I'm not an engineer, and I've really, frankly, never asked an engineer if it's better or not. But it's 2 different ways of skinning this, 2 different ways to skin a cat. Both perfectly fine. It's a style thing. But I got to tell you, that house has always bothered me. I mean, for decades, that house has bothered me. It's like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? It was just crazy, particularly since that was the only house like that. All the rest of them were posts, individual posts set. But this particular village here in Franklin County was occupied at that cusp of change in village organization and so forth. And I've come to realize over the years that archaeology doesn't do so good with change, right? We see this snapshot over here and we compare it to that snapshot over there, and that's very fine. Look at the difference. That's really great. But what do you do when the snapshot is the change? How do you handle that? Well, it's kind of like this. Well, it's kind of like that. I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what to do with this. Heck, when we were excavating that site, we thought for sure it was a completely earlier site. And it wasn't until we were there, like, I don't know, maybe the 4th or 5th week, somebody said, well, Gwynn, we've found a pan sherd. A pan is a shallow, large, shallow vessel. And we knew from previous research at other sites that these large, shallow vessels always dated after 1400 AD. And we're like, whoa, wait a minute, we thought this site was like 1300. How can it be 1400? Wow, what have we done? What are we thinking? Well, then, of course, that sort of resolved the wall trench thing. Okay, cool. So it could be that. And then the radiocarbon dates were like around 1400. We're like, okay, cool. Okay, and then the nature of the pottery and the nature of the stone tools, the arrowheads. And we're like, okay, yeah, okay, okay, that makes sense. So I've just decided that those people made that house just to give me a heart attack in analysis.
And we used perhaps with the rainwater coming down from the outside wall, getting her inside so she'd have something to wash her hands.
Well, actually, you've come up with something that's really interesting because, frankly, when I first started doing archaeological research on 4 ancient villages, we hadn't found houses with house basins. And we're like, what's up with the house basin? Well, with a house basin, if you're down deep and then you have the wall and you can have that coverage there, you can, what would you call it? You can deflect the rain and so forth, so it's not coming down into your house too. Yeah. Yeah, this is the engineering brilliance of these people, right? Because truly, do you really, I mean, I've been camping when I put the tent in the wrong place and it's come up a rain and then there's this roaring torrent of water through my tent. It's not particularly good. And that's just for a weeknight, right? Can you imagine living? I mean, these people knew where to put the houses, how to handle all of this. These people, this is what they do. They don't have any Social Security or anything like that. They do this. They do this really well. Anybody else? Yeah.
I have 2 questions. One, is there any evidence of animal agriculture in this area? And 2, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this area being a center for domestication of those specific plants.
Okay.
Why is that so significant? And why also, if those plants are so significant, did they move away from consuming them?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think we don't know. Okay, so no animal husbandry, but that's a good question. That question led me and my colleagues, one of whom is in the back, to look at that question regarding turkeys. Because in other places, farming peoples have been inferred to have domesticated turkeys. Did we domesticate turkeys here? So we did those various serious scientific things that you do, which you give to specialists to do because that's what they do. Looked at the bones, studied it, no evidence for domestication. However, and this is why you're not going to find out stuff if you don't ask the question. What we did discover, however, is the people who lived at this Fort Ancient village for not 50, not 100, not 200, but for 300 years. What is up with that? Partway through that history of living at that place, they decided, okay, we are going to live here for longer than usual. We have got to get after how this works for us. They managed the turkey flocks. What? Yes, they did. How do we know that? Okay. I can go into depth here. Should I? All right. Turkey wing bones. 350, Dave? 350 turkey wing bones. Well preserved, okay? So here comes the preservation part of things. It has to be preserved in order to ask some of these kind of questions, right? All those turkey wing bones, I don't know if you know it or not, I didn't until we started working with our zooarchaeologist to do this work, that gobblers, boy turkeys, are significantly larger, and you can tell from their bones from the hens, which are girl turkeys. You can tell boy turkeys from girl turkeys. What that means is you can study, if you have a large enough sample, how they were hunting. What were they hunting? What were they picking to hunt? And we saw over time that they began to take more male turkeys than female turkeys. Why is that? Because the girls are the ones who lay the eggs. You don't be killing the girls. Not wanting to cast dispersions on males in any way. But, you know, you just don't need too many guys, but you need a lot of hens to ensure that you have a reliable source of wild turkeys to exploit. I got to tell you, we took our story to the World Turkey Federation conference. And they were like, yeah, those native peoples knew what they were doing. This one guy came up to us and said, I'm going to tell my manager that even native peoples knew what to do, so we need to be getting after these turkeys. It was so weird, right? Because you just assume that everybody knows that, but that's not true.
Last question.
Bison.
Yeah, since we're, Franklin County is sort of on this trace.
Right.
For example, it goes across the Kentucky River, a little bit more recent. To what extent might Native Americans have actually engineered the environment to attract bison, and how might bison have changed the way that they were living or interacting with their environment?
Okay, bison. You know there were bison a long time ago here, right? Bison antiquus. They were friends with, or not friends with, but they were contemporaries with the mastodons, mammoths, and all these. These are big bison. Then no more bison. Then no more bison. Bison come back to Kentucky in the 1600s. So the Fort Ancient people are not hunting bison until really late. It's and they find there are some Fort Ancient sites, not in Kentucky, but in other places where they have found some bison bones. But your question reminds me to say that central Kentucky is a place with lots of weak saline springs. And these four-legged animals, bison, elk, deer particularly, are about going to those salt springs or salt licks. It's important for them. And it's important for us. I mean, we have indirect evidence to suggest that Fort Ancient people made salt by evaporating water from the salt springs, because humans need to have salt. The native peoples followed those trails that these indigenous animals made from salt lick to salt lick, or salt spring to salt spring. It's just recently I realized that I can't use the same. A salt spring is one thing, a salt lick is something else. But they would go, you know, they would create trails, and indigenous people would follow those trails because they knew that the trails led to the springs and the licks, and the animals would be there, and so you could hunt them, and so forth. But in terms of any human intervention with bison, I don't know. My guess is no, but then I don't know. So I'm just going to have to say I don't know. But I do know that a lot of people, in fact, I always thought that there had been good evidence, you know, or I should consider bison at some point for Fort Ancient as an animal. No, not significant, not a significant animal resource for the Fort Ancient people, which is of course completely different from the indigenous people who live out on the plains, where for them bison is everything. And why is that? Because they are nomadic people. They are hunter-gatherers, focus on hunter. And then later on, you know, when the horse came onto the plains. So we're not bison people, we're deer, bear, and elk people. Okay, thanks.